As we left off in our last video, at this time in the Middle Ages, in the early ages period, literacy and religion were directly tied together. In your textbook, your editors Simpson and Orlemansky say that literacy was mainly restricted to the church, and so it's natural that the bulk of Old English literature deals with religious subjects. I'm really kind of hammering on this because I want you to understand that this first part of the class, it's going to feel potentially like there's a lot of Christian teachings happening. You're like, gosh, is this a literature course or is this a religion course? At this time, it's almost one and the same. Not that there weren't other stories or other tales being told, but what was recorded is religious in nature because of the difficulty of manuscript production. Most of the Old English poetry that we have is contained into 4 manuscripts. So compare the idea of 4 manuscripts into endless church information and religious documents. We have to go with what we have. So I just kind of want you to be prepared for that. However, at this time, around the time that the Vikings started to invade for the first time, so pre the 1002 attack, the church started using the Germanic epic poetry style to entertain and develop the understanding of Christianity. So that tells us that Germanic heroic poetry, it was important and was being used. And our big piece for this first unit, one of them is Beowulf, which is an epic poem based off of characters and events of countries outside of England, but it's that style of poetry and that style of storytelling that was really popular as invaders came over and settled. It just spread and it stayed and we kept it. So you're going to see a lot of where the aristocratic, heroic, and kinship values of this Germanic society continue to inspire the church and other stories. It's going to be very similar to the world of Homer in terms of the heroic nature and characteristics. We are going to be, if you look on page 10 of your textbook, there is a whole section that explains societal expectations. But basically, the warriors were to honor, respect, and serve their lord, their king, their general until the end. However, that warrior lord, whatever level he was, in turn had to respect and take care of those under him. So when he conquered a place, he had to share the goods. So the gold, the land, whatever they found had to be shared with the men who had fought for him. And so it's a very give and take situation versus the traditional king, lords, serfs ideas that we have. Now, I'm not saying that's how society was. Those are just some important values that especially guided literature at the time. However, that Germanic heroic society idea was pretty distant from the time it was being developed and used in the Middle Ages in England. So that's why we do get a little bit of that conflict. We also will see some conflict between the heroic code and religion, because the Germanic heroic poetry, as was fitting for the religion from the culture that comes from, was very much so caught up in the idea of fate and everything being how it's supposed to be and different gods, whereas obviously Christianity, there's one God who has a divine will that people should follow kind of thing, and he protects his followers. So there is a little bit of that conflict that happens, but it kind of makes the literature even more enjoyable, or at least interesting to talk about. The poetry of this period is more elegiac, so more serious, more reflective. However, they still have a really powerful moment in poetry where they remember, as your editors call it, the return of spring. So while maybe more serious, there are still really great, powerful, strong moments of joy and everything as well. I will note that romantic love is not as common in these poems. It wasn't as important of a focus. It will start to develop, but it's not really there yet. There are 3 key characteristics. One would be poetic diction, so using language that is poetic in nature. Then you've got formulaic phrases, so phrases that are, the forms are very important and they're very normal for that period. And then you also have parallel syntactic structures being repeated, so the way that sentences and phrases and paragraphs were written were purposely made parallel to highlight that diction, highlight the phrases they're using. The language is more formal in these poems than the average language of the day because they wanted to formalize and elevate speech. So in Old English poetry, the language stays the same throughout the centuries because the goal was to be that more formal language. However, the language itself was very dynamic and changing, and so we don't get a great view of what's changing, but again, we're going to talk about that another time. So this moves us into the next period, which is the Anglo-Norman period of the 12th and 13th centuries. After the Vikings invade again in 1002, I told you there was some chaos, some upheaval as we're again caught fighting that. So in September of 1066, William of Normandy invades the island and conquers. By December 25th of 1066, William of Normandy is the King of England, and he has expanded the Norman rule across the Channel. The Normans are people who are French people. They descended from Germanic tribes, so Norsemen to Norman. They speak French and they are a Christian people. At this time, Old English kind of doesn't get abandoned, but it kind of starts dwindling, and it is going to change into what we call Middle English. But French becomes the language of culture, business, government, everything. So when the French come in, they're here to make the island French, which is interesting. So their religious culture becomes how the English are going to approach Christianity. They build their castle style, their church style. There's a little bit of English flair, but they bring the French ideals and values and ways of doing things over. I will note that they are really fascinated by the old Celtic stories, so they help revive them, but it's going to go from like Celtic to French and then eventually back to English. It can't just be in English. It's got to go through that transition, which gives it a little bit of a flair and changes things some. Because in the French religion, or not French religion, excuse me, in the French style of religion at the time, where the Normans are from, bishops were very important religiously and politically, and so they continue to be rulers, which means that the church gets involved heavily with politics, and the English get involved now in the crusade. This comes later, but the English will get involved with the crusades, and so bishops become more and more powerful, meaning that religion is now more and more powerful and people have to play by those rules more. In this period, we have something called romance drama developed. There are three authors mentioned in your textbook: Thomas of England, Maria de France, and Chrétien de Troyes, who are key in this, but you should know that Roman initially meant a work written in French. It was not always about love and adventure and that kind of thing like we would think about. Eventually, because of these romance dramas, that is what means it was not originally. And interestingly, these romance dramas are influenced by the literary taste and judgment of women of the court. So while women may not be writers, their interests and thoughts really influence how these develop and the content they're going to use. The basic idea of a Roman romance drama is that a knight has to prove his worth because of his hard work, his nobility of character, and brave, deep dreams. Which, in my mind, sounds a little bit kind of like the American dream, right? If I work hard and I'm a good person, then I can achieve great things. So that idea is not necessarily new to anyone, and especially not at this time either, but it is a prevailing genre that everyone was interested in. Religious writings are becoming more popular. Often they're aimed at women and telling them how to behave or what to do. During this period, there are also a lot of change going on, and it's too much to try to tell you, but because these rulers are from Normandy, they are French, they are absentee, which is at first is okay. They're there a lot. They're bringing this influence. But as we move into like the next centuries, you'll see there's a lot of strife happening. And even by the end of the 13th century, we're really starting to push into like wanting a little bit of a break, or maybe going back to our English roots, because these are absentee rulers. They don't really know what's going on with us at this time. I forgot to write it here. And so I do want to mention that during I think it's the 13th century, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is still going on. And so we do get the English view of Norman rule because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is still being produced in that monastery, at least through the 13th century. And so it gives us a lot of good background information as well. And writings have started to shift back into the English language because of those absentee rulers. So in the 14th and 15th centuries, this is where we're going to loosen those French ties. We're going to make sure that we are becoming English again. So how does that happen? Well, as I mentioned, the French language is losing ground. It is still being used at the beginning of this period in Parliament law, business, and high culture, but English is taking over everything else, which won't sound like much, but for a long time, English was basically only used by the very common people and no one else, even the court, was bothering learning it or using it. The fact that it is being used by the court, except for when they're in Parliament or business, is important. And by 1360, Middle English literature is flourishing. So it is on the rise. In 1348, we have the first bubonic plague. A quarter to a third of the European population is wiped out. What that means is that people can change social standings very easily. And there's lots of revolts and wars. People can't keep up with demands of what is needed because of all this debt, which means if you are a ruler who is spread out, especially across the channel, it's going to be harder for you to control what's going on and how your people are feeling. In 1381, they do attempt a wage control. There's a lot of oppressive taxes, which again may feel familiar, even though this is centuries before the American colonies. But there is a revolt in Essex and Kent. They burn down a palace. They behead an archbishop, who is also the treasurer of England, which is kind of revolutionary, the fact that we could do this at this time. And so that does start changing things. The merchant class is going to continue to get power because they are more important now. And so social mobility is happening. The crown is getting involved with economics, which is exciting in terms of like that changes how things are running. And now you don't have to be a Christian to have a position of power or position of work as a civil servant because the crown is involved, not just religion. Poets can become famous at this time, but the fame of poets then is not the fame of people today. But they are starting to become famous people. Julian of Norwich is one. She's one of the first known English women writers. She is a religious writer, but she is very famous, and we still read her today. Chaucer does write during this time, but I do want to note that Chaucer wasn't really famous when he was alive. His fame came later. So yes, he's a famous poet, but he's not famed during this age. Then, in 1415, Henry V overthrows the French rulers. So at this point, England is back to being English, not controlled by the French. However, he dies in 1422, which sets off the War of Roses, trying to figure out who is going to take over. Is it going to be the Lancaster family or the York family? So the Red Roses versus the White Roses. Lancasters win, so Henry VII, aka Henry Tudor, ascends as king, which starts the Tudor dynasty, which kind of marks the end of the Middle Ages, moving in towards the Renaissance period. There's a lot more religious supervision happening during this time that the English take back over. In 1401, we have the first statute that allows heretics to be burned. So if you're saying something that the church thinks is wrong or anti-religion, you can get burnt. The beginnings of modern theater is happening at this time in England with mystery morality plays. A lot more on that later. It's kind of really a nerdy moment for me. King Arthur it was already coming famous because they liked those Celtic stories, but Sir Thomas Malory's version of it really established what is the base form and base stories that then has continued to be wildly popular through today. And then the last big historic moment that happened in this period is in 1476. William Caxton brings movable type to England, which changes how literature is produced and who it can be produced for and the ease of it. And from here on out, literature can go wild in different directions and be available to so many more people.